Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture, I'm just going to be going over some material that I was supposed to cover on 3/19 of 2018. I unfortunately had to cancel classes that particular day. So this lecture is going to cover the material that was supposed to cover that particular day. And we're looking at Chapter 18 from our textbook, American Economic History. All right. So we're taking a look at how the economy basically changed in the antebellum period after the Civil War leading up to World War I. So what changes occurred, and in particular, how did the export and import sectors change during this particular time period? So as an overview, I just want everybody to realize that during this time period between the Civil War and World War I, the U.S. became less dependent upon overseas markets, and in particular relative to how dependent European nations were. The domestic market in the U.S. was growing quite quickly, so much of the production that was occurring in the U.S. was for domestic consumption. So as it says there, 20 to 30% of production was for overseas markets or outside of their economy, and only 6 to 7% for the U.S. And this really reflected differences in comparative advantage between Europe and the United States, but also changing comparative advantage over time during that time period. As new lands were opened up in the United States, in the Midwest, etc., we see the comparative advantage changing in the U.S. relative to other nations, and also other nations becoming more important as trading partners and what they had the advantage in producing. So that all impacted the trade scenarios that we're talking about. Also, there was a decline in international trade as a whole for the U.S. So just realize that really points to the fact that the domestic market was developing more quickly than overseas markets in the United States. So 20 to 30% in 1720 and down to 10 to 15% in 1790. So it's becoming less and less important. So realize that the domestic market is increasing during this time period, probably much more quickly than external markets in the United States. So the thing I want you to realize is that how the trade composition of the U.S. changed over this time period, and realize that very much relates to comparative advantages and changes in comparative advantage, i.e. producing at the lowest opportunity cost. So how the comparative advantage in the U.S. changed relative to other nations, and as new trading partners started to develop, how they had a different comparative advantage relative to us. And also realize that we were shifting quite rapidly away from an agrarian society, moving much more towards a manufacturing society. And also that even though the import and export sectors were declining, the composition of what was being produced for export and what was being produced for import changes quite dramatically during this time period. So here we're going to have I refer to this as a time series bar graph, because this is going to be changing over time as I click on this. So let's take a look at what the exports in the United States looked like in 1821. So this is a percentage of all exports. So crude materials were roughly 60% of exports, crude foodstuffs 5%, manufactured foodstuffs around 20%, semi-manufacturers 9.4%, and finished manufacturers 5.7%. And in particular, I think what you really need to pay attention to is the decline in this percentage and the increase in the percentage of finished manufacturers over time. That's going to be the starkest change that we see. So if we move into the period of 1851 to 1860, we see that the crude materials part does not really change, and it actually increases slightly. But we're starting to see upticks in the finished manufactured goods and also in the manufactured foodstuff. So the manufacturing sector is growing in importance, leading into the Civil War with respect to the composition of exports. If we continue on, we can start seeing a dramatic decrease in the percentage of crude materials that are being exported, and the increased importance of manufactured foodstuffs is starting to creep in. Finished manufacturers is remaining relatively unchanged. But as we continue forward, we can see that the semi-manufacturers and manufactured products are growing importance in composition of exports, while crude materials, crude foodstuffs, and manufactured foodstuffs is decreasing. And then when we get up into right around when the Great Depression hits, you can see that the finished manufacturers are making up the greatest share of exports. So we can see that the crude materials is growing less and less importance during this time period with respect to exports, but the finished manufacturers is becoming more and more important in the composition of exports. We can do the same thing for imports and see how our import profile changes during that time period. So again, we start in 1821, and we can see by far the greatest percentage of imports is coming from finished manufacturers. All right. So let's take a look at how that changes over time and how that relates to these other import sectors that we're talking about. So if we move into right prior to the Civil War, we can see that finished manufacturers, the level of imports as a percentage of all imports is shrinking, while the remainder of these is becoming more and more important. If we continue on, again, what do we end up seeing? We're seeing finished manufacturers becoming less and less important as exports, while we start importing more and more crude materials. Let's see if that pattern continues. And as you can see, it does continue. Crude materials are getting imported at a higher level, and we're importing less and less finished manufacturers. And then when we get to the last section, we can see that trend continues, that crude material imports as a percentage of all imports is growing, while finished manufactured as a percentage of imports is decreasing. So we can see this really shows that shift from an agrarian society, an agricultural society, to a manufacturing society as it relates to what we are importing and what we are exporting into the United States during this antebellum period. Also, even though the composition is changing, the dollar value grows quite large during this time period. For example, exports in the dollar value of exports grew by about 900% during that time period, and imports grew by about 700% fold increase. So I just want you to realize that the composition is changing, but it's growing, but it's not growing as fast as the economy as a whole. So again, this is pointing to how the domestic market is growing faster than the international trade market in the United States. The United States is producing more domestically and consuming more domestically during the antebellum period. So let's just take a look at total imports and total exports just to get a notion of the dollar value and how quickly they're growing. As you can see in 1820, it's quite negligible in dollar terms, and we see a positive trend going into prior to the Civil War, where exports grew 4.5 times during that time period, and imports fivefold. But you can see how exports are growing faster than imports. So again, the domestic economy is developing quite quickly, but you can see this positive trend for total value of exports and imports in the United States. If we break that down into different sections, we can see crude material imports and exports. Again, a positive economic trend, but as you can see here, when we get towards the end of the time period, we end up seeing that crude material imports start to outpace crude material exports by the time we get to the Great Depression. Finished manufacturers You can see that there's a huge difference here when especially we take a look at the end of the 1800s and moving into the beginning of the 1900s, how finished manufactured exports versus imports, the exports are growing much more quickly than imports, tenfold versus a 4.1-fold increase for finished manufactured imports. So even though we're importing less, our propensity to import fell, we still occupied a large portion of international trade. So it's an important thing to realize that even though we were importing less than we were previously, we were still a very important component of international trade. And it shows here, roughly during the entire time period from 1876 to 1910, we were between 10% and 7% of manufactured exports during this particular time period. So it's just showing that even though we were exporting less, we were still an important part of international trade during the time period. If we take a look at manufactured imports, you can see that even though it was a lower percentage, we were gaining in importance of manufactured imports of all manufactured import trade during the time period. Primary products, very much stable, between 14.4% and roughly 17% for exports. And from the import side, again, relatively very stable, 7% to 10% during that particular time period. This slide should not have been in here. I should have deleted this. Sorry for that. Also, the direction of trade. Be aware of how Europe lessened in importance to the United States in terms of exports from 1860 going into the post-World War I period. In 1860, 75% of the exports from the United States were going to Europe. This fell to roughly 50%. So you can see our international trade partners are, in all likelihood, becoming more and more diverse. We're trading with more and more foreign nations. With respect to our export trade, you can see that North America, in particular Canada, is becoming more and more important. So our North American exports were roughly at 7% in 1860 and had more than doubled by 1921 to 1925, mostly due to development of Canada and the development of the Canadian economy. We look at Asia, we can see a dramatic increase in the importance of our trade with Asia, in particular with imports. But in 1860, roughly 2% of our exports went to Asia. This rose to 11% in the post-World War I period. So we see that Europe is becoming less and less important. Canada and Asia are becoming more and more important as a component of our export trade. When we take a look at imports, we see the same sort of pattern developing. Prior to the start of the Civil War, 61% of our imports came from Europe, and this fell to half, 30%, just in the post-World War I period. Again, North America, mainly due to Canada being important, so we were importing a much larger percentage of our of goods from North America relative to Europe. And you can see here a dramatic increase in the level, the importance of Asia in import trade in the United States, going from 8% in 1860 to 27.3% in the post-World War I period. So what we end up seeing here is from the import-export side that Europe is becoming less and less important as a trade partner to the United States, and we are developing new markets, in particular in North America, especially with Canada, and with Asia, both on the import side and the export side. And we wanted to take a look at here is what did the trade balance look like? So in the post-Civil War period, about 10 years after the Civil War, we see we had a deficit in trade balance. And then for the remaining period, we have a trade surplus. We are a net exporter in the United States going from 1876 up until the start of World War I. So it's an important thing to make note during this time period that if we talk about the antebellum period, we start in a trade deficit and we slowly move into a trade surplus period just prior to World War I.